I guess first, I mean, Chiara and Alan, you've just watched it straight away, and we've heard from John already. Can I just ask you to give your immediate sort of feelings on watching it again this evening?
It's ghastly. It's really horrible. It's really cruel and mean and sad. And it's sort of, well, it's just very sad. And that's what, kind of love can do. But I think it's quite wonderful, and it's it was a joy to make, obviously, because the license you have to to delve into that world was very pleasurable.
Yes. How about you, Chiara?
Well, I agree with Alan. I think I was overwhelmingly sad at the end of it. It's quite a long time since I've seen it, but I was also really pleased. I thought that the humour came through really well. And it's still really funny. I know what they're going to say. I don't know what anyone else feels about that. I think it's wonderful, and it's a wonderful film.
Did you feel at the time when you were working on it that you knew what it was going to be, and that it would be full of sadness in that way? Did it feel?
No, I'm butting in. No, I think what Alan's referring to is something deeply personal, which is his partner of a very long time died during the production, actually, and it goes back to my introduction about the climate that we were living in at that time, and we were coming to the tail end of that in some ways, because some people had snuck under the radar because of combination therapy, but there was still a lot of our very close and intimate friends dying. And we were making a film about somebody dying, whose name was Dyer, actually. He was the second partner of Francis Bacon to commit suicide on the eve of one of Bacon's openings, and in a kind of strange sense that there was a sort of we were very conscious of the disenfranchisement of lovers and partners for a whole bunch of reasons that are not on the screen in this film. It's something we were experiencing at that time. So
understood.
But about that time and that period, we were very well prepared, actually, because we'd started work on the film 2 years before this production came together, and in fact the original cast was going to be Malcolm McDowell and Tim Roth. And the night before, all the heads of department, the BFI, the Japanese and French people who put tiny amounts of money into the budget, got together at the Berlin Film Festival, and Malcolm McDowell pulled out, so the whole production collapsed, which ironically gave us an extra year to work together on the script, which certainly needed work, but also on the look of the film, which Alan was fundamental to. Alan and I had worked together on numerous of my kind of more experimental projects prior to this, and on lots of music videos, but we've been friends since the early 80s, so we have a synchronistic language.
It was very planned.
Yeah.
It was very, very planned. It looked quite sort of, there was so little
exactly
resources. Yeah. There were so few resources, financial and kind of. So it was planned, and it's very formal in the way it was made. Even though at the same time we were kind of making it up as we went along, and we allowed as much experimental kind of work to go on. And we were allowed to abandon normal rules of narrative cinema.
There's not much camera movement.
So there's no, that kind of struck me. There's no camera. The camera hardly moves at all.
Well, at
it's
that
very
time,
formal.
At that time I hated, I hate, unless it's the opening sequence of Touch of Evil, I hate gratuitous camera movements. I remember watching Portrait of a Lady by that very talented director whose name I've forgotten, but thinking, why is the camera flying in the air? We're in the 19th century, and this is a Henry James novel. Why are we whizzing up in the air and spinning around and coming around in a circle and back down into the... So but also we were dictated to, by Francis Bacon, And Bacon's tableau, his triptychs in particular, are cinematic. They look like a kabuki stage, and we took that as a kind of point of departure, not just in the production design, but also in John Matson's beautiful cinematography, and also,
But something happened, did it, John, in the process, because the plan wasn't originally yours. There was a prior sort of script that you were involved with, but that was much more conventional.
Yes.
That was based on the Daniel Farson sort of book, and it wasn't going to be a story told in quite that way. And it seems like you really took control of the story and said it has to be told much more visually through the. Firstly, visually through the primacy of Bacon's own kind of.
Well, this really lovely guy called Don Jordan had gone to George Faber at the BBC with a project about Francis Bacon, and I'd made an experimental feature with Tilda Swinton for George Faber at the BBC called Man to Man, which was an adaptation of her stage play that she did at the Royal Court, and that was literally we shot in 10 days. We had about 100 rounds, and we made a feature film. And George Faber, who'd connected with this lovely guy, Don Jordan, who had the idea. In fact, I think Don Jordan wanted to make a kind of trilogy of films about Bacon, Picasso, and maybe Duchamp, which maybe someone should make. But George called me up and said, look, we've got this Bacon project, but it's not really working. And after 2 or 3 meetings with Don and his partner, I realised that I couldn't work within the parameters of what they were offering, but I could see where I could find a story to tell. And I was actually drawing on an experience I had in the 80s where I was doing a pop video for Genesis P-Orage in Los Angeles, and my boyfriend Trojan died of an overdose in my flat in London. And I got a call in LA telling me that this boy was dead. And that for me was a kind of linchpin to hang a story about Francis Bacon losing a lover on, and to invest it with some kind of genuine currency. Like a real, I experienced a lover dying, and I transposed my experience onto Francis Bacon, who, like I said rather frivolously in my introduction, I met him a couple of times, but it was only, in the drunken confines of the colony room and at somebody's party somewhere. I was terrified of him. He looked like a waxwork. He was my hero. But what I chose to do was to hone the story down to one particular relationship. I mean, we bought the rights to Dan Farson's book, The Gilded Gutter Life of Francis Bacon, which I recommend to everybody because it's a really good read. But the film has nothing to do with that.
But that must have been, given all the forces that needed to come together across the BBC, the Arts Council, everyone else to help facilitate this film and make it happen, to unfold, rather than have the Bacon biopic, instead to unfold his story within this relationship, must have been very challenging to get purchase of.
No, because I'd been making films for 20 years. I was clueless in many ways and self-taught, although I had studied under Derek Jacobi, I worked on lots of his films, so I knew what not to do, because I watched Derek's kind of organised chaos, and I thought, I'm actually going to translate a different approach. Maybe I was wrong, but Derek taught me a lot about people management.
Yeah.
And his generosity of spirit and his charm would pull rabbits out of hats in terms of what the budget restrictions were, what the technical restraints were, and collectively, we'd all been working together for some time, so we had a kind of a shorthand language that we could all bring to bear on this. And I think we're kind of slightly missing something here. We had some of the most amazing actors on the planet.
Yes.
Actually, starting with Derek Jacobi, Tilda I'd worked with a bit.
But you were shooting a 2-to-1 ratio most of the film, right? So most of the scenes are
Well,
only shot once,
Right.
or
Yeah.
twice at the most, right?
Chiara would
Yeah,
come and say, you
and
haven't got any
hardly
more. You haven't got any more film today.
And hardly any reverses either.
Yeah. Well,
Most of the sets were kind of
Yeah.
like theatre pieces, fundamentally.
That's why you had
You
so
had a
many
very
mirrors.
theatrical approach, and you could do that by making a film about pictures, as George called them. So that each little scene in the fade to black is like a picture, and it's very frugal way of making a wonderful film, quite an expansive sort of visual kind of piece.
I mean, I said to John Matheson, I want the interiors, and there are lots of them, to look fake. No, to look real, sorry, to look real. And I want the locations to look fake. And I think we had 10 days of locations,
If that.
if that. We had one afternoon in Paris. We stayed in a very nice hotel. There was a very particular agenda about faking it and not faking it, and then also going to extremes. I love a close-up.
There's the
You may have
claustrophobia
noticed.
as well.
Yeah, and the claustrophobia of Bacon's language, exactly. So
Bacon was very in the public domain. I know that Derek Jacobi was able to sort of take character notes from seeing him on TV. He was very often filmed. In terms of George Dyer, how did you approach that character? Was it all there in the Farson book? Did you do interviews? Or did you just leave it as a space for Daniel
It's
to
actually
inhabit?
very interesting. I was lucky enough. Well, I don't know if that's the right word, but I spent a lot of time with Daniel Farson at the Colony Room in the French House, meeting lots and lots of Bacon's friends. A lot of them are in the film, in actual fact. No one had anything to say about George Dyer.
No one had anything to say.
No one. They either didn't like him, which was more often not the case, or they didn't really remember what he was like. And I remember Daniel saying to me, well, the script's not really giving you much to go on. I was like, I know that, but in a funny way, that's the character. And I'm throwing you to the wolves. And in a sense, that's what happened to George.
That's what you feel is there.
It's what happened to George in real life.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to clarify one thing. George Dyer did not fall through the roof of Francis Bacon's studio. I wanted it to be like Alice falling into Wonderland. And they actually met in the Coach and Horses, and Bacon fancied the guy and bought him a pint of beer. What's interesting is an art critic who really slagged this film off when it first came out quoted the film verbatim as fact about 3 or 4 years later. So it's interesting, the power of cinema, that you can kind of lie through your teeth, and cinema makes it truth. But the truth of the truth is that George Dyer was a very disenfranchised, disconnected, minor criminal who Bacon met in a pub and thought was attractive, and the rest is.
You were the artist making the portrait of the artist. How much did you need to identify with Francis Bacon in order to get your purchase on his character?
Like I say, as an art student, when I kind of momentarily called myself a painter, he was a huge hero of mine. But the last thing I would attempt to do is to emulate Bacon.
You constantly used to say that all artists are monsters.
Yeah,
You
well,
have to be.
that's true, and in that sense, I am a monster and an artist. But no, I mean, I've become a drunk as I've gotten older, and I certainly learnt that in the rooms, the Colony Room, and all of those places. And Dan Farson was a very good teacher. But no, if you read interviews with Bacon, he's a very complex man. His conversations with Michael Pepiat are very different to his conversations with David Sylvester. He and of course, if you watch the very, very fabulous interviews with Melvyn Bragg, where they cut a lunch into a kind of 3-minute sequence, and you watch the speed of the pair of them getting pissed off their heads. He was a performer, actually. I mean, but we're talking about the person in front of a camera, not the person who was making paintings. And the paintings are what were fundamentally of interest to me. And he made some very interesting comments about his own work. He talked about the puissance of male flesh, which is a kind of fancy French word for texture or the substance or the feeling. We tried to explore that. I mean, the scenes where you see wrestlers that are trying to emulate Bacon's paintings, you know, we got into big old fat middle-aged wrestlers and got them to wrestle. You know, it's not Daniel and Derek. They're just, but we wanted to convey that non-beautiful side of homosexual activity.
Yeah.
And I think we did it rather well.
I think you did do it rather well. How was it? I mean, it's not exactly what you'd expect in a BBC production, and how much kind of friction was there at the time about how far you could go, how far you wanted to go, were allowed to go, how much audiences would respond?
None really. I mean, there was a very funny moment when I can't remember the name of the guy who was the head of the BBC at that time, but he said, you know, John, this is such a witty, funny film. Couldn't you give it a happy ending? And I was like, what? You know, Bacon walking down the street in Paris saying, I know, I'll paint a picture. No, I think the film...
We had huge freedom.
We had enormous freedom. I mean,
we had freedom until the estate,
Oh, yeah.
Marlborough Gallery kind of came down
But
on
that
us.
gave us another kind of a freedom.
The Marlborough Gallery, who was Francis Bacon's gallery, basically turned around and tried to put an injunction on the film about a week before we were going to shoot it.
They sent my screenplay back, and they'd highlighted every single line of it.
No paintings were allowed
saying
to be
it
in
belonged
the
to
film.
them. Yeah, and we weren't allowed to use the paintings, which of course was the thing that set us free.
Yes.
Because at that point, you know, I was like, okay, the Marlborough Gallery. I sent it to the Marlborough Gallery, to David Sylvester, and to Lucien Freud. And they all were like, no, f*** off. So we were at this point where that's when we said, well, okay, well, let's make the film be like paint. Let's use celluloid as paint, and let's make it, you know, so we, you know, in the Colony Room, you know, we had giant brandy balloons that people in the background are holding, and teeny-weeny ones we were using as lenses, and ashtrays, and bendy mirror, and, you know, so that everything was undulating. I mean, one thing the BFI, or the BBC, I can't remember who it was, said, you can't introduce all your main characters where you don't see anyone is. And I said, well, why? You know, you'll see them in a minute. They'll be in the next scene, or the next scene, or the next scene. So yeah.
That inventiveness with the camera and the use, sometimes the abandonment of lenses, it's so exquisite. It really, really holds the test of time. And you see...
no, it's been a blueprint for a lot of other work.
It was done in camera, most of it as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
No, it was all done in
Taking
camera.
the camera apart and taking the shutter out.
But the opening sequence where, I mean, you don't know that when you're watching it, but Daniel is falling in the opening sequence. We took the lens out completely, and John Matson got a drill with a piece of cardboard on that he ran at the wrong shutter speed. And that's how we got the kind of tearing, sort of ripping-looking quality to the images.
2:1 ratio.
Well, and actually the best thing was that, you know, I'd told Alan that we were going to shoot the whole film Academy ratio, because I was very obsessed with silent cinema. I still am. But at that time I was particularly obsessed with silent cinema. And then about 3 weeks into production, Alan said, we're not shooting Academy ratio, are we? I was like, no. Who told you that? I said, you did. So he designed the aspect ratio of all the sets. But you know what? That's what
chaos breeds images, Bacon famously said. So anything to fuck it up as we went along was good. You know, the whole end set in the bathroom in the Paris Hotel was an accident. It was.
Run out of money, haven't we?
Well, no, we were. The Sylvester
Producer.
Yeah, well, we had, but no. The Marlborough Gallery said we were going to do a representation of the painting, the triptych
exactly.
of George's suicide. There's a very famous
And they
triptych
said,
of it.
you
can't do that with
will sue
intellectual
you off the
copyright.
planet. Exactly.
So I had a drawing, a very quick, crude drawing of the room, and I photocopied it in reverse, rather than so it was white out of black, and it just was obvious what that set had to be. So it's all these sort of accidents along the way in this very, very planned and mannered kind of film.
Well, like the beautiful, just before, after he's had all the drink and pills, it's one of my favourite scenes. And really, I don't know why I didn't get a call from Calvin Klein, but I guess tea-stained underwear isn't his thing. But when Daniel's walking with his one sock into the bathroom, but when he's walking into the bathroom, we had a gobo, which for those of you who aren't filmmakers is a kind of a mask you put in front. We actually had a kind of cardboard shadow, which we put in front of the light, so that the shadow appears over Daniel, although you don't really know but it does. And it's kind of like the Furies, which is Bacon's references to the Oresteia and Greek tragedy are kind of all the way through his body of work. But it was like the Furies are actually pursuing him even into the bathroom, even after he's taken all those pills and drunk all that champagne and the whiskey and whatever. So it was like a bunch of kids playing and having a laugh. I mean, kids, we weren't that young.
I thought we were. No, you weren't.
I was young.
I don't know. But yeah, you are. But no, but there was the real director of the film is Francis Bacon. He tells you what to do when his paintings are very cinematic, and he was influenced by cinema. His love of Eisenstein, his love of Edward Muybridge. There's a kind of template is there for you, and actually his love of images, which of course the studio, which I have to say, we were not allowed access to the real studio. We weren't allowed access. I mean, we were allowed access to the Colony Room, but you couldn't get a camera crew in there because it was the size of a shoebox. So Alan built those two sets in a studio in the East End, and we populated the film with lots of real colony cronies, and
they were very supportive.
some of them thought they were in the colony. They'd send runners off to Tesco's to get them more whiskey because the bar wasn't working because the drink was all fake. But and when Derek walked on, Sandy Fawkes, I remember going, "Oh, Dad, Francis," and Derek's like, "No, Sandy, I'm not Francis because Francis is dead." But people were. It was a very what Alan created with his department was so beautiful, so realistic. I mean, I thought I was there sometimes, and we were sometimes.
When you talk about the humour, enjoying the humour now, I mean, obviously there's the very, very brittle, painful humour of the Colony Room, which is also occasionally funny, but also
It's not really funny.
But generally not. It's lacerating and painful, right? I mean,
no, the thing is, I said this to all of the actors. The point about a bunch of drunks is they think they're funny, but they're not. And actually that couldn't be true of the Colony Room of anywhere on the planet. They all think they're the most witty, amazing people, but no, they're a bunch of boring drunks, and you're trapped with them. And I know that from experience. And like I say, tragically, it turned on me, and I became one myself. But that kind of lacerating bitchiness was. I mean, I grew up with that with Round the Horn on Radio 4 when I was a little kid. My mum and dad would be listening to Kenneth Williams and Kenneth Horn and whoever. They're all talking Polari on Sunday lunchtime. It's like, this is a weird British kind of phenomenon that's true now in a different way, but then was kind of part of the landscape.
Yeah. And where the humour does, I think, come is in those moments where, incredibly, the sadomasochistic relationship becomes domesticated and becomes almost like. I'm reminded slightly of the Duke of Burgundy and Peter Strickland saying he was trying to make Terry and June meets Mothlight. There's something what happens when you kind of bring a sadomasochistic relationship into a domestic sort of space that endures over time. But inevitably, there's something touching about the observations about.
In my experience of sadomasochism, it is always banal and pathetic and rather tawdry because the fantasy is all here, and the practice is a bit pedantic. It's like leather queens who are actually hairdressers. It's kind of not. It's not a great look, but it's a fact of life. Of course, in this instance with George Dyer, and like I say, he was on the fringes of the craze and on the fringes of who was the other family. He was a minor player who hit pay dirt. Because although Bacon wasn't the superstar at that time that he became, and has certainly become since his death, he was a star within this tiny little orbit of other, some supernovas and some other people who, Freud couldn't become famous until Bacon was dead. It's very interesting. There were people. John Deacon, who's a minor character in this, was a Vogue photographer who managed to take bad pictures of Sophia Loren, but that's another story. Ask a question.
Well, it's probably almost time to hand it over to the audience. So if you could get your questions prepared. I guess for me, is this how it feels looking at the film now? Certainly for me, so many of those locations have gone. Like when I first saw it back in 1998, I think, this was like an introduction to all the key gay sort of sites in London you wanted to go, to York Hall and Bethnal Green.
Francis Bacon hated gays.
The homosexual haunts, the queer haunts of London. I don't know. I guess for my generation, some of those terms have become less important.
I know, but he was particular about it. He was very particular about it.
They've pretty much all gone.
All those gays with their rainbows and their clogs.
Yeah. Anyway, over to you guys. Your turn.
I asked him.
Wow.
You let him in a lift.
No, weirdly, and this is completely nothing to do with it, but I'd always, obviously, I loved his music. Not particularly his film soundtracks, although I really loved his soundtrack to The Last Emperor. But I actually met him in the 80s. I was in a weird kind of Blitzkiddy kind of thing with the Yellow Magic Orchestra, where they wanted some new romantics to be in a photo shoot with them. I reminded him of that when I met him. But no, I think he's a genius composer, particularly like I love his own music, but I like his work with David Sylvian. And obviously his work for Bertolucci is kind of incredible. And I wanted something that would be romantic, but actually what I really wanted was the kind of clinical aspect of his electronic work. And I was lucky enough to go to his studio in New York and work with him. And you could say to him, I don't really know what kind of music Bacon liked, but I imagine it would be a Bach cello sonata, and he'd go and play it on a keyboard. And then you could mention Stockhausen, he'd sample a bit and go blah, blah, blah. And music's very important to me, it always has been. I used to make music videos. And film soundtracks are crucial because along with sound design, you can put stuff on screen that's not on the screen with music and with sound design. And Sakamoto was a kind of perfect match, I felt, for Bacon. So, but like I say, I just asked him and he said yes. I sent him the script and he said yes. Since then I've had Brian Eno and Angelo Badalamenti, so I'm kind of a composer groupie.
Did anyone say no to you with the film? Because the supporting cast, the extras.
Yeah, the estate of Francis Bacon's kind of big.
No.
Oh well, yeah, okay.
The best thing was that they sent this legal letter, pages and pages of stuff, Chiara happened to be married to someone who was in an even bigger legal company in London, so we sent her and went back.
So you had to handle all that, did you, Chiara? Did you have to front?
Yes, I mean, we
From
knew
that.
they were going to be intractable about it, so we knew that there wasn't any point in pursuing it as far as using the pictures was concerned. We had to defend the fact that John wrote the script and it was an original work, and they were trying to claim that, you know, some things that you were quoting from...
I was quoting Jean Genet or
all sorts of other
Cavafy
people
or...
were Bacon's own
Yeah, there was. They
words.
claimed every line, literally, they'd highlighted every single line, even the directions, and there weren't that many, believe me. But they'd, you know...
Maybe you tapped into his soul and they recognised that.
No, I don't think so. I mean, yeah, there are lots of public domain things which we were allowed to use, and of course, if I'm not quoting Bacon direct, I'm probably quoting Jean Cocteau or Jean Genet or someone else who I find very interesting, and sometimes I was being creative. No, it was a very strange experience.
But to go back to your question, actually, you know, what we did learn a great lesson, which was just ask.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's no harm in it. People do say yes.
I don't know how many you spotted, or you'll see, I'm sure, in our full production notes that go with our programme note, but the list of extras, which includes the entire 90s British art scene, from Tracy Emin to Angus Fairhurst, but also includes Anita Pallenberg, and I mean, performance was a big influence on you for the film as well, right?
Yes,
so you
indeed.
were also getting to pick stars of some of your favourite films that
weirdly,
inspired
you
you
know,
and
the
bring them
films,
into
the films that really influenced this, which have really influenced me, are, you know, performance for sure. Paul Schrader's Mishima is a big influence on this. I mean, literally in some instances, where he just nicked ideas verbatim and just took them. But yes, you know, the art kids were no one then. They
We
were
couldn't afford extras.
They were just art students who I happened to know either from the colony or, you know, from wherever else around town. And of course they're going to tip up and spend a day in costume and be in a movie because it's like, oh, I'm in a movie. You know, I don't think we'd get Tracy Emin or Sarah Lucas now. But, you know, I mean, you don't even really see Tracy. I think I cut her out. Stella McCartney ended up on the cutting room floor. She was in a scene of Go-Go Girls on the tube. And I remember actually John Matheson saying, can you get that girl with the furry face to move back a bit? And I was like, that's Stella
But she
McCartney.
did sing Can't Buy Me Love
Yeah, she did.
on the tube.
She did sing Can't Buy Me Love on the tube to keep
Where is that
everyone...
footage now?
I know it should be an extra, a DVD, Stella McCartney.
No, but you know, it was just the point was I was trying to make a film about London's art scene in the 60s and early 70s, and so I used the people who were part of London's art scene then, because it was a obvious choice, and I had the ability to do that.
I mean, as a result, the film does.
Anita, obviously.
The film does define, I think, the kind of the coming together of film and art, or the close, almost coming together of film and art at that time, in a way that feels quite remarkable, both informally in terms of sort of a collective set of inspiration and
Well, Bacon was the only
personnel,
really-
in terms of your role, in terms of the ability for the funding bodies that be to believe in and invest in an artist at that time. I mean, it does feel like a quite a rare moment
No, but
where those things have really come together.
It's important to remember that back then, Bacon, I mean, apart from Hockney, were kind of the only art stars that existed. You know, none of, you know, Damien. You know, I asked Damien to play the role that Gary Hume plays of the artist with the bad tie.
Did you catch that? That it's Gary Hume who in the French House says.
I can tell you can't paint by the look of your tie.
Yeah.
It was a cheap gag, but it's actually he did say that to an artist. No, but you know, what the YBAs at that point were on the brink of becoming a phenomenon that now, of course, each of the individuals would expect to have a film made about them. But back then, they were just a bunch of art students who'd just come out of college. Obviously, Damien had done the Frieze exhibition, but the whole kind of Saatchi tsunami of what artists could become hadn't kicked in at that point. It was literally on the cusp, and the only models for successful British artists in that, however you qualify or quantify success, were people like Francis Bacon, David Hockney, maybe that's it. Henry Moore. There were lots actually, and there were lots more than they're worth talking about in this context. But none of those kids were famous.
Yeah. I mean, that film happens. Then what next for you? Because it was such a, I mean, well, not a huge commercial success, but a reasonable critical success, except for Alexander Walker. I mean, it was very well regarded.
Yeah, no,
did it feel to you like a world was opening up?
Alexander Walker didn't just give it a bad review. He wrote a letter to his own newspaper complaining about the fact that it had been funded by the BFI. I mean, he was on a mission. I mean, if that's not closet queenery gone berserk, I don't know what it is. But for a Presbyterian uptight, I mean, the weird thing was, he vilified and destroyed Derek at every opportunity, Derek Jarman at every opportunity. He was a very strange man because as an intelligent and gifted critic, he had no kind of, what's the word? Clue.
Mouse.
No, the film was a huge success, actually, because we were lucky enough to be chosen for Un Certain Regard in Cannes. It played in the middle of the week. It got terrific reviews from the Hollywood Reporter and the other one, the other Hollywood paper, Variety. And we had phenomenal international sales. I mean, I don't think it cost anyone very much.
Where's the money?
Yeah, where is the money? But it played all over the planet. I went to Tokyo, to Warsaw, to it played in one cinema in Paris for about 3 years solid, and like in one cinema for 3 years solid, just like the Mystère de Picasso used to, when I was a kid. It has
a very long tail. Obviously, we're releasing the Blu-ray at the moment, but it's been on recently at the ICA, the Whitechapel. It's a film that has a terrific currency.
Whenever there's a Bacon exhibition, it's in the gift shop. It's kind of like a Banksy film. It's what's so funny is that, in fact, I'm now very close friends with one of the main executors of Francis Bacon's estate. They weirdly, just after I'd finished shooting, said, "Oh, would you like to use the paintings?" I was like, kind of a bit late. We've finished filming, and Bertolucci used them in the opening credits, so I don't think we're going to put them in our closing ones.
Director's cut.
But now, whenever there's a Bacon exhibition, it's there as if it was a documentary, which I have to underline, it is not. It's not true. I mean, there may be elements of it that are true, but it's almost entirely, I would say, poetic license. No? If you want to know about Francis Bacon, I said this at the time, there are brilliant documentaries about him, not necessarily the Melvyn Bragg one, but there are brilliant documentaries about him. There are brilliant books about him. And if you really want to know about Francis Bacon, look at his paintings. Don't look at this film. This is my attempt at entertainment, and we're struggling to make some more. You say he's very theatrical. I actually knew him as a child from I, Claudius, which was really, for me, a pivotal piece of television. And a very quiet, restrained performance, actually, and rather brilliant. I was very reluctant to have Derek for reasons of my own. And then I watched a very beautiful film about Alan Turing, which BBC Wales religious department have made, and it was only shown on television. It's far, far better than the thing that was made last year. With The Imitation Game. The
wonderful film you were talking about. It's really good.
It's really good, and there is no female love interest because Alan Turing had no interest in female love. I'll just say that now. Sorry, No, I think he gives an enormously subtle performance, actually. And what was very difficult for him at the time was he wasn't openly gay back then. His parents were still alive, which made him, for his own reasons, remain kind of in the closet, although I don't think it was a secret to anyone. They was queer as Christmas. But for him to take on this role and to play a kind of raging homosexual who was also a great intellect, lest we forget. I mean, I don't know if sometimes I wonder if the screenplay and my direction lets Francis Bacon down, because Francis Bacon was a great intellectual, a very serious intellectual artist and thinker. But he was also a visceral, nasty fag. And that Derek could tightrope walk that performance, was partly my direction, because I hope I share some of those qualities too. But also Derek could draw on his own knowledge of those aspects. But these people, you have to remember the theatre of the Colony Room, the theatre of the French pub. I'm talking about boring drunks who think they're really funny. And that's the knife edge that all the actors had to walk all the time, was pretending to be drunk. I mean, we haven't talked about Tilda Swinton's performance in this film, which I think is astonishing. She was pregnant with twins. She was having to chain smoke herbal cigarettes, but she's unrecognizable. She's unrecognizable, isn't she? In this, and I actually had the bad teeth made for her for the film I'd done with her before, but she's got rotten teeth. So yes, it is pantomimic in the sense that world, particularly the kind of underground, subversive, closeted, gay, queer, whatever you want to call it, subculture of that time was theatrical, because that was the only stage they had, because everywhere else they had to pretend to be straight or to be ordinary or to be normal. But I think there's nuances in all of those performances that go a bit deeper. But I like what you're saying. I know what you're saying. And yes, it's kind of theatrical. Well, that's a very perceptive comment. The answer, I think, is both. Yes, I know that to my personal detriment, that it can push you to the edges of madness, but also, a bit of what you fancy does you good. It's quite useful to be a bit mad. Otherwise, how could you bear the hideous world we're living in right now? I think the people we're talking about, as in the characters in this film, we're all on a knife edge, and actually the very kind of sad, depressing element of this film to me, I didn't watch it tonight, but believe me, I've seen it a few times. It's like moths around this light bulb of a person, and the tragedy is that most of these people genuinely loved him. I think he genuinely loved them, but they lived in a culture where not just homosexual love, but the kind of love that friendship is about wasn't permissible. Whether it's because of your status as a journalist or as an art critic or as a blah, 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 whatever it might be. And perhaps that's still true. We talked about all of our friends or acquaintances who are now art superstars. I wouldn't wish fame on my worst enemy. It's interesting, last night, I did all the videos for Schneider Connop, blah, blah, blah. Yesterday, people start sending me these messages saying she's attempted suicide again. And all I can think of is this beautiful kid that sang this beautiful song that went to #1 all over the planet, and there's this little doe-eyed creature with the vocal cords of God. And her children have been taken away, and her lovers are dismissing her, and she's... So, yeah, fame and all of that, it doesn't distort the people who become famous, it distorts the people around them. And it's a really cruel trick, and I wouldn't be any of them for all the tea in China.